The wind came down from the Chiricahua Mountains, not like a whisper, but like a predator. It was a physical thing, a beast of ice and fury that clawed at the lonely cabin of Abigail Rosewood. She was a woman forged in silence and sorrow, a widow whose husband's ghost was the only company she kept. But on the third day of the blizzard that buried the world, a new ghost stumbled into her life. He was Apache, the very spectre of her deepest fears, frozen bleeding and dying at her door. What do you do when the devil himself begs for sanctuary from a greater storm? For Abigail, the answer would not only seal her fate, but bind her soul in a way no preacher's words ever could. The silence of the Arizona Territory was a language Abigail Rosewood had learned to speak. It was a language of vast, aching loneliness, spoken in the rustle of sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk painting circles on an endless turquoise sky. Her small, sturdy cabin, built with her late husband Daniel from ponderosa pine, and stubborn hope stood as a solitary monument to a life that had been violently unwritten. It was nestled in the protective foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains, a place of breathtaking beauty and brutal, unforgiving truths. A year. It had been 1 year since the raid. 1 year since the silence had been shattered by the screams of men and the thunder of unshod ponies. A small band of Chiricahua Apache, their faces a blur of paint and righteous fury, had descended on their fledgling settlement. Daniel, with his gentle hands and fierce love for her, had fallen defending a life they had barely begun to build. The cavalry had come too late, their bugle calls a hollow echo against the backdrop of smoke and grief. They'd called the attackers renegades, a splinter group off the San Carlos reservation, but the distinction meant nothing to a widow. The face of her enemy was singular, and it wore the features of an Apache warrior. Now her days were a metronome of survival. Tending the small flock of sheep, Daniel had been so proud of patching the roof he had built, mending the clothes he had worn. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the shell of a shared dream. The nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, and the town of Wilcox was a 2-day journey. She was an island in a sea of rock and dust. The first sign of the blizzard came not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a sudden malevolent chill that seemed to seep up from the very bedrock of the earth. The sky, usually a brilliant cloudless blue, turned the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly purple-gray. The wind began to moan a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the log walls of the cabin. Abigail, her senses honed by a year of solitude and vigilance, felt the change in her bones. She had seen harsh winters in her native Pennsylvania, but this felt different. This felt predatory. She worked with a frantic, practiced efficiency. She herded the nervous sheep into the small, sturdy lean-to, attached to the cabin, their bleats swallowed by the rising shriek of the wind. She checked the security of the heavy wooden shutters, hammered an extra nail into a loose board on the stable door, and hauled in enough firewood to last what she prayed would only be a few days. The air grew thick with ice crystals, tiny needles that pricked at her exposed skin. The world outside her small fortress of solitude was dissolving into a swirling vortex of white. For 2 days the storm was her entire world. The sun was a forgotten memory. The mountain range that usually dominated her view was erased, replaced by an impenetrable wall of snow. The wind was a constant assault, a living entity that battered and shook the cabin, searching for any weakness, any crack to exploit. Inside, Abigail moved like a phantom. She stoked the fire in the stone hearth, the crackling flames a defiant roar against the storm's fury. She ate sparingly hardtack and dried venison, her appetite stolen by the oppressive roar. In the brief lulls, the silence that followed was somehow more terrifying. It was a dead, muffled silence, the silence of a tomb. It was in one of these lulls on the morning of the third day that she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groaning of the cabin timbers. It was a sound that did not belong in the white death outside. A weak, rhythmic thudding against the main door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was a wild animal, a bear or a mountain lion, driven mad by the storm and drawn to the scent of the sheep. She snatched Daniel's Winchester rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece. The cold steel was a familiar, grim comfort in her hands. She checked the load, her movements swift and sure. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice thin against the heavy wood. There was no answer. Only another series of desperate, weakening thuds. It sounded like a fist, but a fist with no strength left in it. A person. Out here, in this. It was impossible. No traveler could have survived this long. The thudding stopped. A profound silence descended, broken only by the howl of a renewed gust of wind. Abigail stood frozen, the rifle held tight against her shoulder. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it. Whatever was out there was already dead or dying. To open the door was to invite the storm inside, to risk her own life for a ghost. But then, a flicker of something else stirred within her. The memory of her mother's voice reading from the family Bible. "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. There were no angels in this land, only devils. Yet she couldn't shake the sound, the desperate fading beat of a life giving up. Cursing herself for a fool, for the softness that Daniel had loved, and that she now saw as a liability, she moved to the door. The heavy bar was slick with frost. With a grunt of effort, she lifted it. She cracked the door open a few inches, peering into the maelstrom. The wind ripped the door from her grasp, slamming it wide open with a deafening crash. A wave of snow and ice flooded the floor, and the fire in the hearth recoiled, hissing and spitting as if struck. And there, half buried in the snowdrift that had accumulated against her door, was a man. He was face down, a crumpled heap of buckskin and black hair. For a moment, she saw only a dying stranger. She took a step forward, a cry of pity on her lips. Then he shifted a final convulsive movement, and his head turned just enough. The world stopped. Even caked with snow and ice, the high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the copper skin. It was unmistakable. He was Apache. A warrior. A strip of faded red cloth was tied around his forehead. His long black hair matted with snow and frozen blood that trickled from a gash on his temple. He wore no war paint, but his features were etched in her memory, a composite of the men who had galloped through her nightmares for a year. Hate cold and pure washed over her, momentarily chasing away the biting chill of the storm. It was a visceral, physical reaction. Her knuckles whitened on the stock of the Winchester. Let him die. The thought was sharp and satisfying. It was justice. It was retribution, delivered not by a bullet, but by the hand of God in the form of this blizzard. He was one of them. The people who had turned her into a widow, who had stolen her future and left her with nothing but slants and ghosts. To leave him here would be to watch the final fitting chapter of her tragedy unfold. He would freeze solid within minutes, a nameless forgotten monument to his own savagery. She took a step back, ready to slam the door to seal him out and let the storm have him. But her eyes caught on his hand, curled in the snow. It was a strong hand, with long, capable fingers now blue with cold. It wasn't the hand of a demon. It was the hand of a man. A dying man. The blizzard raged, a physical manifestation of the war in her soul. To save him would be a betrayal of Daniel, of everything she had lost. It would be welcoming the serpent into her home. But to leave him, to stand by and watch a human being freeze to death, even an enemy, what would that make her? Would it not carve out the last piece of her humanity, leaving her as cold and dead as the landscape outside? Daniel's face swam in her memory, his kind eyes. He had been a good man, a man who would have given the last of his water to a thirsty dog. He would not have done this. He would not have stood by, with a sob that was torn from the deepest part of her. A sound of rage and grief and utter confusion. Abigail dropped the rifle in the snow. She lunged forward, grabbing the frozen buckskin of the Apache's tunic. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight. She pulled her boots, slipping on the icy floorboards, her muscles screaming in protest. The wind fought her, trying to tear him from her grasp to claim its prize. No, she screamed into the storm, the word ripped from her lungs. "You will not have him. I will not let you." She didn't know who she was screaming at. The wind. God. The ghost of her husband. Or maybe she was screaming at herself. With a final desperate heave, she dragged the unconscious warrior over the threshold and into the relative warmth of the cabin. The storm howled in fury as she slammed the heavy door shut. The sound of the bar falling into place, a thunderous, irrevocable finality. She had done it. She had saved him. She had brought her nightmare in from the cold. The man on her floor was more ice than flesh. His buckskin shirt was frozen stiff, crackling like burned parchment when she touched it. Snow was packed in his hair, his eyebrows the hollows of his cheeks. His skin had a terrifying waxy pallor, and his lips were a deep, alarming blue. For a long moment, Abigail feared she was too late, that she had dragged a corpse into her home. She pressed two trembling fingers against his neck, searching for the pulse she was sure she wouldn't find. And then she felt it. A faint, thready flutter, as weak and fragile as a trapped bird's wing. Thump, thump, thump. The discovery of that fragile pulse galvanized her. The internal war of hate and duty was momentarily silenced by the immediate practical demands of saving a life. This was no longer about a nameless Apache. This was about a human heart that was seconds away from stopping. Her first task was to get him out of the frozen clothes. This proved to be a grotesque and intimate struggle. The buckskin was fused to his skin in places, and she had to use her own body heat, pressing her hands against the frozen material to soften it enough to work it free. She averted her eyes, a flush of mortified heat rising in her cheeks as she stripped him down. His body was lean and hard, a topography of muscle and old scars. A long, jagged scar ran down his left side, a testament to a life of violence. Another, puckered and round on his shoulder, looked like an old bullet wound. This was a man acquainted with death. She dragged him closer to the fire, the rough floorboards scratching at his bare skin. The hearth was her only ally. She piled on more wood until the flames leaped high, casting dancing, distorted shadows across the cabin walls. The heat was immense, but the man's flesh remained stubbornly, unnervingly cold to the touch. She knew from tales of frost-bitten trappers that warming a man too quickly could kill him. It had to be a slow, agonizing process. She grabbed every blanket she owned, the thick wool one from her bed, the patchwork quilt her mother had made, even Daniel's old horse blanket from the stable, and piled them on top of him. Then, fighting back a wave of revulsion, she began to chafe his limbs. Starting with his feet, which were like blocks of ice, she rubbed them briskly with her hands, trying to force life and circulation back into the frozen tissues. His skin was rough, calloused. She worked her way up his legs, his arms, her movements mechanical, her mind blessedly numb. She was no longer Abigail the widow, or Abigail the avenger. She was simply a woman fighting a battle against the encroaching cold. Hours bled into one another. The only clock was the shifting of the shadows and the relentless howl of the blizzard outside. The cabin became a crucible, thick with the smell of wet wood smoke and the faint coppery scent of the man's blood from the gash on his temple. She cleaned the wound as best she could with a rag and whiskey, the raw spirit making him flinch and moan in his unconsciousness the first sounds he'd made. The sounds were guttural, alien. He spoke in a language she did not understand, a torrent of words spoken to phantoms in his fevered mind. Shisinde, Iukidao, Nantan. The words were sharp, commanding, then would soften into something that sounded like a plea. In his delirium, he was not the silent, stoic warrior of her nightmares. He was vulnerable. He was someone's son, perhaps someone's husband or father. The thought was a traitor, and she pushed it away, focusing on the rhythm of her work. As the day wore on, a change began. A faint flush of pink started to creep back into his skin, chasing away the deadly blue and grey. A tremor started in his hands, then grew into a violent, rattling shiver that shook his entire body. It was a good sign, a sign of his body fighting back, but it was terrifying to watch. His teeth chattered with a sound like stones being knocked together. He was caught in a violent limbo between freezing and burning. His body racked with fever from the cold and the infection in his head wound. Abigail brewed a thin broth from the last of her salted beef and forced spoonfuls of the warm liquid between his chattering teeth. Most of it dribbled down his chin, but some went down. She was exhausted, her arms aching, her mind numb, but she didn't stop. To stop now would be to surrender him back to the death she had stolen him from. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the second night, he'd been in her cabin. The fever broke. The violent shivering subsided into a deep, still sleep. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, evened out. The flush on his skin softened from the angry red of fever to a more natural, healthy hue. She touched his forehead. It was still hot, but the dangerous, searing heat was gone. He was slick with sweat. She sank back on her heels, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it left her dizzy. She had done it. He was going to live. And with that thought, the full, terrifying weight of what she had done crashed down upon her. The warrior was no longer an abstract problem, a lump of frozen flesh. He was a man, a living, breathing Apache man sleeping on her floor. The temporary truce her mind had called during the emergency was over. The hate, the fear, the grief all came rushing back, sharper and more potent now that the object of those feelings was no longer on the brink of death. She scrambled back away from him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. In the soft firelight, his features were strong, almost noble. A proud, aquiline nose, a firm mouth that even in sleep seemed set in a line of grim determination. His black hair, now dry, fanned out across the blanket. He was the enemy. He was the reason she was alone. Her eyes fell on the Winchester, lying where she'd dropped it near the door. She picked it up, the weight of it, both a burden and a comfort. She could end it now. So easily. One shot. It would be an act of self-preservation. Who knew what he would do when he awoke? He was a raider, a killer. To harbor him was suicide. She could claim he attacked her. No one would question it. A lone widow defending herself against a savage. It was the story everyone in this territory expected to hear. She raised the rifle, the barrel cold and heavy. She centered the sight on his chest, right over his heart. Her finger tightened on the trigger. His chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The rhythm she had fought so hard to restore. Could she do it? Could she execute a sleeping, helpless man? Even an enemy? Her hands began to tremble. This was not justice. This was murder. It was the very thing she condemned his people for. To pull the trigger would be to kill a part of herself, the part that still believed in mercy, the part that Daniel had loved. It would be to surrender to the hate and become the very monster she feared. With a choked cry, she lowered the rifle. She couldn't do it. She was not a killer. But the fear remained. She dragged a heavy wooden chest against the wall opposite the hearth, and sat on it, the rifle laid across her lap. She would not kill him, but she would not trust him. She would watch him. When he awoke, she would be ready. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. She sat her vigil through the long night, watching him, listening to the dying gasps of the blizzard outside. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and by dawn, a profound, eerie silence had fallen. The storm was over, and in the first pale light of the new day, filtering through the cracks in the shutters, the Apache warrior's eyes opened. They were not the eyes of a delirious man. They were dark, sharp, and utterly lucid. They fixed on her, instantly taking in the scene with a speed that startled her. He saw her, the rifle in her lap, the cabin, the dying fire. There was no fear in his eyes. There was wariness, confusion, and a deep, calculating intelligence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence in the cabin was as thick and heavy as the snow outside. It was a standoff. The woman who had saved him, and the man who was her mortal enemy, finally awake and aware in the aftermath of the storm. The real storm, Abigail realized with a jolt of terror, was just beginning. The world had shrunk to the space between them. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of violence and the raw, unnerving reality of their situation. Baishan, he would later tell her, his name meant knife. In his tongue did not move a muscle. He lay on the floor, his dark eyes tracking her every breath. He was assessing, calculating. He saw the rifle across her lap, not as a threat, but as a statement. He was a warrior. He understood the language of weapons. It meant she was afraid, but it also meant she had chosen not to use it while he slept. A complicated act from a complicated woman. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. Now that he was awake, the reality of his presence was overwhelming. He was larger than she had realized, his frame taut with a coiled energy that even his weakness couldn't completely conceal. Days passed in a state of fragile, unspoken truce. The blizzard had buried them completely. The snow was piled high against the door and halfway up the shutters. They were prisoners together in her tiny cabin. Communication was a clumsy dance of gesture and inference. Hunger was a language they both understood. She would ladle stew into a bowl and push it across the floor to him with a long stick, retreating back to her post with the rifle. He would eat his eyes, never leaving her. He watched everything she did. He watched the way she stoked the fire, the way she kneaded dough for bread, the way her hands, though chapped and calloused, moved with a certain grace as she mended a tear in her dress. He saw the sadness that clung to her, like a shroud, the way her eyes would sometimes drift to the empty chair by the fire. A flicker of pain crossing her features before being replaced by a mask of grim resolve. She in turn watched him. She saw the disciplined way he moved as his strength slowly returned. He would sit up, testing his limbs. Then he began to stand, using the wall for support. His movements economical and filled with a quiet power. He was never idle. He took a small piece of charcoal from the hearth and on a spare piece of wood began to draw. He drew maps of canyons and mountains, stars and suns. He drew horses so full of life they seemed ready to leap from the wood. He was not the mindless savage of the settlers' tales. He was a man with a mind, with a culture, with a world inside him she couldn't begin to imagine. One afternoon, a week after the storm had broken, the first twist in their strange cohabitation occurred. A sound from outside broke the silence, the jingle of harnesses and the crunch of snow. A patrol. Abigail froze her blood, turning to ice. They would be checking on the outlying homesteads after the blizzard. If they found him here, they would hang him from her tallest pine tree and probably arrest her for harboring a renegade. Baishan heard it too. He was on his feet in an instant, his weakness forgotten. His eyes darted around the small cabin, searching for an escape that didn't exist. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not a plea for his life, but a question. What will you do? Panic warred with a sudden, inexplicable instinct to protect him. Not the Apache, but the man she had spent a week nursing. The root cellar, she hissed, pointing to a trapdoor hidden beneath a bearskin rug. He didn't hesitate. He understood. He lifted the heavy door, lowered himself into the dark, musty space below, and pulled the door down, leaving only a sliver of a crack. Abigail threw the rug over it, just as a heavy fist banged on the door. Mrs. Rosewood. You in there? It's Sergeant Miller. Her heart was a wild thing in her chest. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and unbarred the door. The glare off the snow was blinding. 2 soldiers from Fort Grant sat on their horses, their faces red from the cold. Sergeant, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Thank the Lord. I wasn't sure I'd see another soul till spring. It was a bad one, ma'am. Miller said, his eyes scanning the cabin behind her. We're checking on everyone. You fared all right? Enough food? I'm fine. Well stocked, she lied. Her stores were dwindling fast. Daniel built this place to last. That he did, the sergeant said with a sad smile. He had known, Daniel. We tracked a small party of Chiricahua renegades up this way, just before the storm hit, led by a buck named Baishan. Real trouble. They hit a supply wagon near the pass. We lost their trail in the snow. You haven't seen any sign. Anything unusual? Abigail's blood ran cold. Baishan. So that was his name. A name the cavalry knew. She had the leader, the prize, hiding beneath her floorboards. The lie came easily to her lips, born of a complex mix of fear and a strange, newfound loyalty. Nothing, Sergeant. Nothing but snow and silence. If I had, you'd know it. My rifle's always ready. She patted the Winchester she had propped near the door, a piece of stagecraft that seemed to satisfy him. The sergeant nodded. "Good to hear. Stay vigilant, ma'am. They could still be out there holed up somewhere." He tipped his hat. "We'll be back through in a week or so." She watched them ride away, their blue coats stark against the endless white. When their figures had disappeared, she barred the door and leaned against it, her body trembling. She had lied to her own people. She had protected him. She lifted the trap door. Baishan emerged from the darkness, his face an unreadable mask. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. He had heard everything. He knew she had saved him again this time from the rope. That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted irrevocably. The invisible line between them had been crossed. She was no longer just his reluctant savior. She was his co-conspirator. The wary distance between them began to shrink, filled by a new charged awareness. He began to help. He would rise early and use his knife, a formidable blade he had kept hidden in his boot, to carve tinder for the fire with meticulous precision. He watched her struggle to rehang a heavy shutter that had been knocked loose by the storm. Without a word, he took the shutter from her, lifted it effortlessly into place, and held it steady while she secured it. His proximity was unsettling. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of wood smoke that clung to him. One evening, as she was preparing their meager meal of rabbit stew, he did something that changed everything. She was stirring the pot, her back to him. He came to stand beside her, so silently, she didn't realize he was there until he held something out to her. It was her knife, the one she used for cooking. He had taken it and spent the afternoon sharpening it on a whetstone he'd found in Daniel's old tool chest. The blade gleamed in the firelight, honed to a razor's edge. She took it from him, their fingers brushing for the first time. A jolt like lightning shot up her arm. She looked up at him, startled. His expression was serious, intense. He pointed to the newly sharpened knife, then to his own formidable blade, resting on the mantel. Then he touched his own chest, and then, with a deliberate, almost reverent gesture, he pointed at her. He stepped back and retrieved the bowl of stew she had just ladled for him. Instead of retreating to his corner, he sat on the floor near the hearth. He then motioned for her to sit not across from him but beside him. Hesitantly, she lowered herself to the floor, her own bowl in her hands. He took a piece of bread from her plate. He dipped it into his own stew, then held it out to her lips. It was an offering, an act of profound intimacy in the silent, isolated world they shared. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to recoil from this savage ritual. But her heart starved for any kind of connection, for any gesture that wasn't born of violence or necessity, betrayed her. She opened her lips and accepted the offering. He watched her chew, his eyes dark and solemn. Then he spoke, his voice raspy. From disuse, the English words broken, pieced together from observation and memory. "My life you save," he said, touching his chest. "My knife, sharp for you. My food is your food." He paused, searching for the right words. His brow furrowed in concentration. He looked at her, at the cabin that was her home, at the fire that was its heart. "In my people," he said, his voice dropping low, "woman who saves warrior, gives him fire, shares his food. She is Ashtla." He struggled with the translation. "She is his wife." Abigail stared at him, the half-eaten bread turning to ash in her mouth. What she whispered, the word barely audible. "You are wife," he stated, not with aggression, but with the simple declarative force of a man stating a fundamental truth. I am your husband. I hunt for this house. I fight for this house. I am Baishan. You are wife of Baishan. It was not a proposal. It was a proclamation, a tribal rite performed not in a bustling Apache camp with the consent of families, but in the crucible of a snowbound cabin, a vow forged in survival and sealed with a shared meal. He had taken her gesture of saving his life, an act of Christian charity in her world, and interpreted it through the lens of his own culture. To him, she had not just saved a stranger. She had claimed him, and in doing so, he was now claiming her, binding her to him with a code of honor she couldn't comprehend. The world tilted on its axis. She had been a widow. Now, in the eyes of this Apache warrior, she was a wife. She had saved a man from freezing, and in return he had taken her soul. The stew in her stomach turned to lead. Fear, outrage, and a terrifying, bewildering flicker of something else, something that felt dangerously like connection, waged a fresh and violent war within her. She looked at the man beside her, her enemy, her patient, her protector, her husband. The blizzard outside had ended, but the storm inside Abigail Rosewood's cabin had just reached its terrifying, chaotic peak. I am not your wife. The words sliced through the warm air of the cabin, sharp and cold as an icicle. Abigail scrambled backward, her body moving before her mind could fully form the thought, the rough floorboards scraping against her palms. The earthen bowl of stew, a moment before, a symbol of their fragile truce, lay shattered between them, its contents pooling like a dark wound on the wood. She came to her feet in a clumsy, desperate motion, pressing herself against the rough-hewn logs of the far wall, as if she could merge with them, disappear into them. Her hand flew to her throat, a purely instinctual gesture of defense. I am not your wife, she repeated, her voice a ragged whisper that trembled with a year of compacted grief and fury. My husband is dead. His name was Daniel. Saying his name aloud felt like a betrayal, like she was introducing his ghost into this impossible situation. I saved your life because you were a human being freezing to death at my door. That is all. It was an act of mercy, not a contract. You cannot simply claim me with a piece of bread and a few words. Baishan rose to his feet, not with the explosive speed she had seen glimpses of, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was somehow more intimidating. He stood by the hearth, the firelight carving deep shadows onto his face, making it an unreadable mask of bronze and darkness. His eyes, however, showed no anger. They held a profound, deep-seated confusion, the look of a man who had presented a great prize only to see it thrown to the floor and shattered. In my world, he began, his voice low and steady, the English words carefully chosen. A woman does not take a warrior from the hand of Garn, the mountain spirits, unless she means to bind him to her fire. To give a man life is to take responsibility for that life. I have no horse, no people. My life was worth less than the snow it was buried in. You gave it value again. My vow is not a chain. It is a shield. It means my knife, my strength, my breath, all stand between you and the world. Is this not a good thing? His logic was so alien, so rooted in a world of spirit and survival. She couldn't comprehend that it only fueled her rage. A good thing she cried, the sound tearing from her throat. My husband is in a cold grave because of your people, because of men with knives and fury in their eyes, just like you. You ride down on us, you burn and you kill, and you expect me to find it a good thing, that one of you has declared me his property. The accusation finally struck home, the personal venom of it, cutting through his cultural confusion. He visibly recoiled, not in guilt, but as if she had struck him. A flicker of something sorrow, maybe even anger of his own, passed through his eyes. "I am Chirikawa," he said, and his voice held a new edge, a hard, resonant pride. "A warrior of the Chokanen band. We fight the Indaa soldiers who hunt us. We raid the wagons that carry their guns. We take back the horses they stole from us. But we do not butcher settlers in their homes. There are other bands, renegades, desperate men, whose honor is gone. I did not kill your Daniel. That is not my way." "You're a liar," she spat the word, tasting like poison. She wanted to hurt him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain she lived with every day. "You're all the same to me." He did not argue further. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw not the deceit of a liar, but the profound weariness of a man who had been misjudged his entire life. He had spoken his truth. That he believed it, she had no doubt. Whether it was the truth, she couldn't know. He bent down carefully, picking up the larger shards of the broken bowl, his movements economical and precise. He then retreated to his corner, leaving her alone with the wreckage of their truce and the echo of her own hatred. The days that followed were suffocating. A cold war descended upon the small cabin, a silence far heavier and more complete than the one Abigail had known in her year of solitude. It was a silence filled with his declaration and her rejection, a living entity that sat between them at all hours. The snow outside began its slow, inexorable retreat, a constant dripping reminder that this strange imprisonment was coming to an end. The sound of melting ice from the eaves was like the ticking of a clock, counting down to a confrontation she did not know how to face. Their routines became a stiff, silent ballet of avoidance. He would rise in the pre-dawn chill, his movements whisper quiet, and rebuild the fire. He would then slip outside into the blue-gray light sometimes, for hours. He was scouting, she knew, reading the changing landscape, reacquainting himself with a world that had almost cast him out. He began to hunt. One morning, she opened the door to find 2 rabbits, skinned and cleaned with surgical precision hanging from a nail by the door. It was a provider's gesture, an act that screamed the word husband, and she resented it with every fiber of her being, even as her stomach rumbled at the thought of fresh meat. She cooked the rabbits in a simmering, resentful silence. When the stew was ready, she no longer pushed his bowl across the floor. She simply left it on the hearth. He would come in, take the bowl, and eat on the far side of the room, his back partially to her. It was a small concession, a recognition of her rejection, but the space between them still crackled with unspoken things. He saw the way she struggled to haul water from the now accessible creek, her shoulders slumping with fatigue. The next day, she awoke to find the buckets full to the brim, sitting just inside the door, the water still bearing the biting chill of the morning air. He saw her shivering in the evenings, her shawl pulled tight. He left a perfectly tanned deer hide where he'd gotten it she couldn't imagine draped over the chest where she sat. It was softer and warmer than any of her wool blankets. Each gesture was a silent repetition of his vow. I will protect, I will provide. Each act of care was an argument she didn't know how to refute. Her resolve began to fray. Her hatred once a solid shield was being eroded by 1,000 small kindnesses. She would find herself watching him as he worked his hands, surprisingly deft, as he repaired a broken harness with an awl and sinew from his own small pouch. She watched the fluid power in his shoulders as he chopped wood, the focused intensity in his eyes as he stared into the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, in a world she would never see. The clear-cut image of the savage Apache was blurring, replaced by the far more complicated and dangerous image of Bai Shan the man. The path to the outside world finally cleared. A muddy track flanked by walls of dirty melting snow now connected her to the world that had forgotten her. And with its appearance, a new, sharper fear took root. The cabin once her prison had become a sanctuary. Out there were the soldiers Sergeant Miller had spoken of, men who would see Bai Shan hang. Out there were her neighbors who would shun her, or worse, if they knew the truth. Out there was a world that had no place for them together. It was on a bright, deceptively warm afternoon that the outside world came to them. Bai Shan was on the roof, his bare feet sure on the damp wood, testing a patch that had leaked during the storm. Suddenly, he dropped his body, going flat against the roofline. It was not the movement of a man who had slipped. It was the instinctive, instantaneous reaction of a predator sensing danger. He slid silently down the steep pitch at the back of the cabin, landing with a soft thud on the damp earth. A moment later he was inside the door, closing without a sound behind him. 3 riders, he said, his voice a low whisper, stripped of everything but urgent fact. No, not riders. They are on foot, coming up the path. White men, armed. Abigail's blood went cold. She hurried to the window, peering through the small gap between the shutter and the frame. 3 men silhouetted against the bright snow were trudging up the muddy track to her cabin. They were not soldiers. Their clothes were a mismatched collection of worn buckskin and filthy canvas, and they carried their rifles with a lazy carelessness that spoke of long familiarity. Even from a distance, she could see the predatory slouch in their shoulders. They weren't neighbors, they were trouble. They will have seen the tracks, Bai Shan stated, his mind working steps ahead of hers. 2 sets, a man and a woman. They will not believe you are alone. He glanced at the root cellar. Hiding is no good. They will search. His eyes met hers, and he moved not toward the cellar, but into the deep shadows near the hearth, a space between a woodill and the dark stone wall. You will speak. I will listen. He drew his knife, the blade a sliver of deadly light in the gloom, and then he was gone, seeming to dissolve into the darkness itself. A heavy, confident fist banged on the door, making it rattle in its frame. Hello, the house. Anybody home? The voice was gratingly cheerful, yet held a dangerous, swaggering undertone. Abigail took a moment to compose herself, her hands slick with sweat on the stock of Daniel's Winchester. She unbarred the door and opened it only a few inches. The man in the lead was tall and thin, with a long, unwashed face and hale, watery eyes that seemed to take everything in at once. He smiled, revealing a gap where a front tooth should have been. Well, now looky here, boys, he drawled, looking past Abigail to his 2 companions. One was a hulking brute of a man with a vacant expression. The other was short and weaselly, with shifty eyes. A pretty little flower blooming all alone in the wilderness. His gaze slid over Abigail, insolent and lingering, making her skin crawl. We're just weary travelers, ma'am. Got turned around after the big storm, wondering if you could spare a hot meal. We got money to pay." He held up a tarnished coin, but his eyes told her he had no intention of using it. "This is a private homestead, and I have nothing to spare, Abigail," said her voice firmer than she felt. She tried to shut the door, but the leader's boot shot out, blocking it with a solid thud. The false cheer vanished from his face, replaced by a cold petulance. "That ain't a very Christian attitude, ma'am," he said, pushing the door wide open and stepping inside as if he owned the place. His companions followed, fanning out their eyes, greedily scanning the small cabin. They saw the single cot, the sparse provisions, the evidence of a woman living alone. They saw an opportunity. "I reckon you got more than you're letting on," the leader said, his eyes locking onto the Winchester in her hands. "A woman like you all alone. You must get awful lonely." He took a step closer, the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies rolling off him. "Let's make a deal. You fix us a meal, keep us warm for the night, and we'll be on our way in the morning. And you can start by giving me that rifle. You won't be needing it." The hulking man chuckled a low, stupid sound. The weaselly one was already sidling toward her small chest of belongings. The threat was no longer veiled. It was raw and immediate, and filled the small cabin, choking the air from her lungs. This was it. The nightmare every solitary woman in the territory feared. Her hands, slick a moment before, were now bone-dry, locked onto the rifle. She would not be a victim. She would not be broken. "The first one of you who takes another step," she said, her voice low and trembling with a cold, hard rage, "is a dead man. Get out of my house." The leader laughed, a genuinely amused, ugly sound. "She's got grit, boys, I like that." He started toward her, confident and unhurried. "You can't shoot all three of us, darling. What happens when the gun is empty?" He was 10 feet away. Then 8. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel at his chest, her finger tightening on the trigger. And then the shadow in the corner exploded. It wasn't a man moving. It was an elemental force. Baishan erupted from the darkness with a speed that defied belief, a silent, lethal blur of motion. He crossed the cabin in 2 powerful strides. The leader had no time to even register the threat, his mocking smile still on his face as Baishan's left arm snaked around his throat, cutting off his air. The glint of steel was the last thing he saw clearly as the razor edge of Baishan's knife pressed deep into the soft flesh beneath his chin. The other 2 men froze their jaws, hanging open in comical, terrified disbelief. The cabin, which had seemed empty except for the lone woman, had produced an Apache warrior from thin air. Drop Baishan growled the single word, a guttural promise of death. He applied the slightest pressure with the knife, and a line of brilliant red appeared on the leader's throat. A strangled, gurgling sound escaped the man's lips, his eyes bulging with pure terror. The rifles of his companions clattered to the wooden floor as if they had become red-hot. Outside. Now Baishan commanded, using his captive as a shield. He dragged the terrified leader backward toward the door. The other 2, their hands raised high in surrender, scrambled after him, desperate to escape the confines of the cabin and the silent demon within it. Abigail stood rooted to the spot, the Winchester still pressed to her shoulder, watching the scene unfold through the open doorway. In the bright, unforgiving sunlight, Baishan was a figure of absolute authority. He disarmed the men with a contemptuous, brutal efficiency, throwing their pistols and knives far into the deep, slushy snow. He did not kill them. He shoved their now blubbering leader into the mud, then pointed down the path. "You walk," he snarled, the words sharp and clear. "You look back. You run. I will take your hair and leave you for the crows." The threat needed no embellishment. The three men, stripped of their weapons, their courage, and their dignity, stumbled away from the cabin. They slipped and slid in the mud, casting terrified glances over their shoulders, before finally breaking into a desperate, clumsy run, disappearing down the path. Baishan watched them go, his body poised and tense until they were nothing more than small, fleeing specks in the distance. Only then did he seem to relax. He calmly gathered the rifles they had dropped and turned back toward the cabin. He stepped over the threshold, his face once again a calm, unreadable mask. The warrior who had moved like lightning was gone, replaced by the quiet man who shared her home. He looked at Abigail. She was still standing in the exact same spot, the heavy rifle shaking in her hands. The strength that had held her up during the confrontation drained away in a single gut-wrenching wave. A sob escaped her, and then another. The Winchester slipped from her grasp, thudding onto the floor. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto the wooden chest, burying her face in her hands as the terror and relief washed over her in a violent cleansing flood. He had saved her, not just her life. He had saved her from a fate that made her soul recoil. He had fulfilled his vow. He had stood between her and the world. He had fought for her house. He had protected her. After a long time, her sobs subsided. She looked up. He hadn't moved. He was simply watching her, giving her the space to face the demons they had just vanquished. The last vestiges of her hatred, the final stubborn ghosts of her prejudice, had been burned away in the crucible of those few terrifying minutes. He was not the cause of her old life ending. He was the reason her new life was continuing. "Thank you." She whispered the words, inadequate, fragile things. He gave a slight, solemn nod of acknowledgement. He then stepped forward and picked up the rifle the lead man had dropped. It was a new model, Henry far superior to her old Winchester. He checked the action with a practiced eye, then held it out to her butt first. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time she did not see a stranger or an enemy. She saw a partner, a protector, a man of honor. "For the wife of Baishan," he said. The words were not a claim or a declaration, but a simple statement of fact. A fact that had just been proven in blood and fear. Slowly, Abigail reached out and took the rifle. Her fingers closed around the smooth, worn wood. It felt solid, balanced, and right in her hands. This time she did not argue. The word wife no longer sounded like the shackle of a prisoner. It sounded like a shield. It sounded like the promise of a shared dawn in a wild, unpredictable world. Their life would be lived between two fires, that of the white man's world and that of the Apache welcome in neither. But looking at the man who stood before her, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would no longer be facing the flames alone. The story of Abigail and Baishan is not a simple tale of love, but a testament to the raw, untamable spirit of the West. It's a story of how survival can shatter prejudice and how two people from warring worlds can forge a bond stronger than steel in the heart of a blizzard. Theirs was a marriage not of words and lace, but of shared bread and sharpened knives, a tribal rite born of necessity that became a fortress for their souls. They chose a life in the space between hatred and acceptance, creating their own tribe of two against a world that would understand neither of them. If their journey from sworn enemies to soulmates in the unforgiving wilderness has captured your imagination, please let us know. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with others who appreciate tales of the gritty, untamed West, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the dramatic heart of history. Thank you for listening.